Have you noticed it too? It seems like we're bumping into wildlife more and more these days.
Yeah, you're right. It's like everywhere you look, from deer munching on gardens to those little critters you hear rustling around at night.
I mean, it's not always a bad thing, right? But it definitely raises questions about how we're all sharing this space.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to untangle in this deep dive. We're going to explore this growing overlap between human lives and the lives of wild animals.
We've got some really fascinating insights to draw on from a recent town hall meeting, actually. It was a pretty lively discussion between a local resident, a Mr. Johnson, and a wildlife biologist, Dr. Olivia Carter.
It was. They really hit on something that a lot of people are grappling with these days. How do we balance the importance of wildlife with the very real challenges their presence can bring to communities, whether it's on farms or even in our own neighborhoods?
Right, because it's kind of a two-sided coin. We want to protect nature, but then you've got situations where wild animals are causing damage to crops or even posing risks near schools and parks.
And that's where things get tricky. So what we're going to do is dive into those conflicts, look at the different perspectives, and explore what some of the solutions might be. We're not here to take sides, just to unpack what's going on and hopefully shed some light on this complex issue.
And to kick things off, we're going to start with a story that Mr. Johnson shared at the town hall. It's something I think a lot of people, especially those living in rural areas, can probably relate to.
Oh yeah, it's a classic wildlife encounter. Mr. Johnson was talking about his neighbor, a Mr. Ellis, who's been farming his whole life. And one morning, Mr. Ellis went out to his cornfield and found, well, you can probably
So
guess.
half of it was just gone, totally wiped out.
Gone, like something out of a movie.
Hmm.
Mr. Ellis thought maybe some crazy weather had blown through, but then he saw the tracks.
Deer tracks.
Everywhere, a whole herd of them had decided to have a feast in his cornfield. And Dr. Carter pointed out that this kind of scenario, unfortunately, isn't all that uncommon.
Not at all. It's a major issue for farmers and ranchers. And it's not just deer either.
Right. It's everything from wild pigs rooting around to bears looking for a quick and easy meal. These animals are incredibly resourceful when it comes to finding food, especially as their natural habitats shrink due to human activity.
Which is understandable. If you're hungry and your usual food sources are dwindling, you're going to go where the food is, even if that happens to be a farm.
Makes sense. But this whole issue isn't just confined to rural areas. It's something that people in cities and suburbs are dealing with too, as Mr. Johnson pointed out.
Oh, absolutely. He mentioned something that I think a lot of us have experienced at some point. Raccoons getting into attics.
The classic attic invaders, right? You hear them up there scurrying around, making a racket.
I mean, they're pretty clever, I'll give them that.
Yeah.
But it can be a real pain. And then Mr. Johnson also brought up coyotes being spotted near playgrounds, which is definitely a concern, especially for parents.
Yeah, that raises the stakes. And Dr. Carter chimed in with some other examples of how urban wildlife can go beyond just being a nuisance and actually cause some pretty serious problems.
Yeah, she got into some specifics, which I thought was really interesting. What was it? Something about squirrels and power outages.
That's right. She said squirrels and raccoons have a knack for getting into electrical equipment, and sometimes they can actually cause power outages by tampering with power lines.
Wow, I never would have guessed that.
And then there are the beavers. You think of beavers as being these kind of cute, industrious little creatures.
Right, building their dams and all.
But their dam building can back up water and lead to some pretty significant flooding, especially on roads and in residential areas.
I guess it's not so cute when your street's underwater because of a beaver dam.
No, not so much. And then, believe it or not, she mentioned feral hogs causing havoc in some unexpected places.
Really? Where? Like golf courses.
Golf courses, parks, you name it. Apparently, they love to root around in the turf, tearing things up and causing quite a bit of damage.
It's amazing how adaptable these animals are. They find a way to make a living just about anywhere.
They do. And it all comes at a cost, of course. Dr. Carter stressed that repairing the infrastructure damage caused by wildlife, whether it's fixing power lines or dealing with flooded roads, can be really expensive for communities.
It makes you realize how much we rely on those things working properly and how easily wildlife can disrupt that.
Yeah, it's a hidden cost that we don't always think about, but it highlights how important it is to understand these conflicts and find ways to minimize them, not just for our own safety and convenience, but for the economic well-being of communities too.
Now, here's something that I was curious about, and Mr. Johnson actually brought it up at the town hall as well. With all this talk about wildlife causing problems, what about the animals that are already struggling? Like endangered species.
Right, you'd think if common wildlife is causing issues, endangered species must be facing even greater challenges, right?
That was my thought exactly. But Dr. Carter pointed out that it's not always a simple equation.
Yeah, it's more nuanced than that. While human development and habitat loss are definitely major threats to endangered species, they also face competition from other wildlife, including invasive species, and habitat destruction caused by certain wildlife populations that are thriving a bit too well.
So it's not just a humans versus wildlife situation when it comes to endangered species.
Mm,
There's this whole web of interactions within the animal kingdom itself that's playing out.
exactly. And it can have a ripple effect. Dr. Carter gave a couple of examples that illustrate this. Remember those feral hogs we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, the golf course destroyers.
Well, they also have a habit of destroying the nesting grounds of native birds, including some that are endangered. So they're not just a nuisance, they're actually contributing to the decline of some vulnerable bird populations.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. It shows how interconnected everything is.
It does. And she also brought up the issue of invasive fish, which can outcompete native fish for food and resources. When those native fish are already endangered, it puts even more pressure on them to survive.
So it's not just about protecting wildlife in general, it's about managing these complex interactions to make sure we're supporting the entire ecosystem, including the most vulnerable species, while also addressing the very real concerns that people have about wildlife impacts.
It's about finding that balance where both humans and wildlife can coexist in a way that's sustainable for everyone. And of course, this led to the big question that Mr. Johnson raised, which is what can we actually do about all of this? What are the solutions and how can communities get involved?
It's the million-dollar question, right? We've talked about the problems, but what can we actually do to make things better?
Well, the good news is that there are solutions, and Dr. Carter had some practical ideas to share, starting with what she called non-lethal methods, which are often the first line of defense.
So things that don't involve harming the animals.
Exactly. One of the most effective approaches is habitat modification. This basically means making areas less attractive to problem wildlife.
So if you've got a raccoon problem, you might make sure your trash cans are secure and that there aren't any easy food sources around your house.
Exactly. And for farmers, it might involve planting certain types of crops that are less appealing to deer or using natural barriers to deter animals. Then there's fencing, which can be really effective for protecting crops or sensitive areas. And while it's not always the ideal solution, relocation can sometimes be an option.
Relocation, meaning trapping an animal and moving it somewhere else.
Right. It can be tricky, though, because you have to make sure the animal will be able to survive in its new environment and that it won't just become someone else's problem. But in some cases, it can be a humane way to deal with a particularly troublesome animal.
Right, you can't just drop a bear off in the middle of nowhere and expect it to figure things out. And then Dr. Carter also talked about something that I know can be a bit controversial, regulated population control.
Yes, this is where things can get sensitive. But she presented it as a tool that, when used responsibly and ethically, can be part of the solution.
So we're talking about things like hunting or sterilization programs.
Exactly. And it's important to emphasize that these methods are typically carried out under very strict regulations and based on scientific data about the animal populations and their impacts.
Right, it's not about just going out and getting rid of animals. It's about managing populations in a way that's sustainable for the ecosystem and for human communities.
Precisely. But beyond all these specific methods, Dr. Carter really stressed that one of the most important things is education.
So it's not just about wildlife experts figuring things out. It's about all of us understanding the animals we share our space with.
Exactly. The more people know about local wildlife, what attracts them, what deters them, how to avoid conflicts, the better equipped we'll all be to live alongside them safely and peacefully.
So it's about us adapting our behavior too, not just trying to control the animals. And Dr. Carter had some really concrete suggestions for how communities can take action and be part of the solution.
She did. Even small things can make a difference. For example, reporting wildlife sightings to local authorities can help them track animal movements and identify potential problem areas.
That makes sense. The more information they have, the better they can manage things.
And then something as simple as securing your trash cans properly can prevent animals from getting into them and becoming habituated to human food sources, which can lead to all sorts of problems.
Right, it's about making our neighborhoods less inviting to wildlife that might cause trouble.
Exactly. And for those in farming areas, using effective deterrents to protect crops and livestock is crucial. There are all sorts of strategies, from fencing to motion-activated sprinklers that can discourage animals from coming too close.
So it really is a team effort involving both the people who work directly with wildlife and everyone in the community doing their part.
It is. And at the end of the day, Mr. Johnson's desire to find ways to protect his property while still respecting wildlife really encapsulates the challenge we're all facing. And Dr. Carter's willingness to engage in this conversation and share her expertise shows how important it is to keep talking, to keep learning, and to work together to find solutions.
It's a reminder that there aren't always easy answers, but that open dialogue and collaboration are essential. We're all in this together, humans and wildlife alike.
We are. And when you step back and consider everything we've talked about today, from the farmer losing his crops to raccoons and addicts, the impact on endangered species and the range of solutions available, it paints a picture of a truly complex web of interactions.
It really does make you think about your own backyard, so to speak. Whether you live in a bustling city or a quiet rural community, chances are you're sharing your space with some form of wildlife.
And that brings us to something for you, the listener, to ponder. As you go about your day, consider this. What's one small but realistic change that you or your community could make to foster a more harmonious coexistence with the wildlife around you? It's a question worth reflecting on, and hopefully this deep dive has given you some food for thought as you explore your own relationship with the natural world.
It really has. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I think it's given us all a lot to think about.
I agree. And thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of human-wildlife interactions. Until next time.